904. Okay, so again, welcome everyone. I'm Yvonne Schwab, ACG Silicon Valley CEO. And as many of you already know, ACG is the leading business-to-business networking organization in Silicon Valley. We not only provide connections, but also access to capital and content to our ACG community. ACG Silicon Valley is offering a variety of virtual events in the coming months. We invite you to visit our website at acgsv.org to see the full calendar, including an event on innovation at the edge, as well as a panel discussion on microgrids. We will also have our monthly round robin with the ACG San Francisco chapter on November 19th. Those are always real fun networking events. Now, we are excited to offer you today's event, which would not have been possible without our sponsor, Deloitte, a multinational professional services network. Deloitte is one of the big four accounting organizations and the largest professional services network in the world by revenue and number of professionals. So thank you. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Ian Nasman, who will be leading us off today. Ian is a partner in Deloitte's San Jose audit practice. He has been a member and supporter of the board of ACG for the past few years and has a strong interest in supporting companies from their initial audits through their initial public offering. Ian, I'm handing it over to you. Take it away.
Okay. Thanks, Yvonne. Well, thanks for the intro. And as Yvonne mentioned, I'm Ian Nasman. I'm a partner based here in Silicon Valley in the audit group at Deloitte. And also been a member of ACG, and Deloitte and ACG have enjoyed a long collaborative relationship that spanned over 15 years here in Silicon Valley. And we're really proud, Yvonne, to be here with you presenting with ACG today. The event that we're going to present today is an overview of our 14th annual Digital Media Trends Survey. And for those of you who've been with ACG for a number of years, you may have attended our presentation in the past on this topic. I believe this is the 6th time we presented this topic with ACG here. And that being said, the topic and really the results are a little bit different this year. As we all know, we're in the midst of COVID. So some of our materials will focus on pre-COVID and post-COVID results and how data and digital data is now being consumed. As Yvonne mentioned at the outset, we want to make sure that this conversation is interactive. While your mics will be muted during the first part of the conversation, we'll have polling questions throughout the conversation. I'll be managing a text chat, so feel free to chat in any questions you have as we're going through, and we'll make sure to pause the dialogue to answer those questions. And at the end, we'll leave time for unmuted lines for questions and conversations as well. I'm excited today to be joined by Hanish Patel, a managing director in our consulting practice, and Kevin Downs, a senior manager. Both have presented this topic a number of times. And I think what you'll find is this is, as I said, engaging, it's personal, it's interactive, and they'll help us to navigate the dialogue. So pass it over to you, Hanish, to make an intro and then start walking through the dialogue today.
Thank you, Ian. And again, thank you for all of you for inviting us to come present this material. As Ian and Yvonne mentioned, I'm sure you'll all be putting yourselves in the shoes of this data and saying, well, how do I stack up against everyone else? And we absolutely encourage you to do that. I know Kevin and I do that year after year to see how we're evolving, as well as just what consumers as a whole are evolving. Quick introduction of myself, and then I'll pass it to Kevin. As Ian mentioned, I'm managing director in our consulting practice, been with the firm 14 years. I've been doing this actual survey now for its 8 years going on. And I spend a lot of my time with tech, media, and telecom companies, particularly helping them bring new products and offerings to the market. And with that, I'll hand over to Kevin for a quick introduction as well.
Thank you, Hanish. And again, Ian and Yvonne, thank you for having us. And thank you all for joining us for this. Kevin Downs, as a senior manager in Deloitte Consulting, I also support our tech, telecom, and media clients. I am our sector specialist focused on that area for the United States. And one of the things that I do as part of my duties here is also manage our research. So this is our Digital Media Trends 14th edition survey that I kind of manage and run for the firm here in the US. And with that, we'll just kind of jump on in. For those of you who might not be as familiar with this, digital media trends, this is an annual survey. This is our 14th edition, our 15th year. And this is really focused on trying to provide insight into how consumers are interacting with different kinds of media products and services, as well as the various technologies, and really elicit from them their attitudes and behaviors that they may have towards these services, towards advertising, social networks, and even regulation, which is something that's very timely in our current environment. We'll go ahead and we'll move on here. So just briefly, we're going to cover a number of topics today. So we'll talk a little bit about the devices that consumers have then used to consume all of this content. We'll talk a little bit about subscriptions, both of the loading up that we've been seeing, as well as some of the reductions in the churn that has a lot of companies kind of concerned, in terms of trying to drive retention and stickiness. We'll talk a little bit about advertising and ad-supported growth as it pertains to video and some of the extrapolations we can make there. And then we'll kind of wind up with gaming and its kind of rise to being one of the preeminent entertainment activities for especially the younger consumers. And then we'll talk, there are 6 areas that we tend to focus on, we're looking at right now as kind of the emerging areas as we look to the future. Just a little background on the survey this year. So in this edition, as Ian mentioned, this year was a little different. Normally we run one survey each year. This year we actually ran 2. We ran one pre-COVID, and then we ran another in May to really kind of listen, what's starting to change? What trends are we starting to see as consumers really start to adapt to the COVID-19 pandemic? And one of the key things that we do is we weight all of our data back to the US Census so that we can get the most accurate representation of what consumers are doing in the US. And when we look at consumers, we break them into these 5 generations, from 14 to above 74. And we really do that because most of the trends that we've seen over the last decade have really started with the younger consumers. And so we try to focus on 14 to 23-year-olds in that Gen Z category, getting them young. We can start to identify those trends earlier before they've really migrated to some of the older generations. And Hannes will talk a little bit about that as we get into subscriptions and some of the evolution we've seen there. But let's go ahead and we'll jump right into the devices. And one of the things that we focus on when we look at entertainment devices, this is not an exhaustive list, obviously, of the entertainment devices, but these 11 devices are important in that they give a different type of entertainment experience to the consumers. And when we look at this, it's striking that over half of consumers own the first 7 of these different devices. And when you start to cut this by different behavioral groups, like those who subscribe to music or those who subscribe to streaming video, this ownership grows, and you start to see even more devices being owned. And the interesting thing about this, so even though over 50% own 7, they also own more than one of these devices. And so we start to see this appetite for devices as a precursor that drives a lot of the behavioral trends that we see in consumption. And when you look at the kind of appetite for devices across the different generations, it can be easy to assume that it's the youngest generations that are really driving this appetite, and that wouldn't be entirely wrong. However, it's important, I think, to also recognize that the older generations, boomers and matures, we've seen this evolution in them as well. Over half of the boomers and matures own 5 of these different devices. And one of the trends that we've been watching over the last 3 years is the kind of movement of the voice-enabled home digital assistants. We've seen this ownership start to increase, not just among the younger generations, but we've also seen it starting to increase rapidly among the older generations. And so this kind of ownership by generation is something that we really do find some value in to tell us, what trends might we be about to see take hold in the market. And one of the things, it's not always just about entertainment. There are lots of devices. The average household has about 11 internet connected devices per household and about 7 different screens upon which they can consume content. As we've looked at this over the last few years, connected appliances, has topped the list for quite some time. Voice-enabled speakers has rapidly risen to a second place. What's been very interesting is we've started to see a little bit of an evolution among the home appliances. And this is everything from, it started with lights and cameras, and we've seen this starting to move to more of the household control items and appliances, such as smart refrigerators, as well as some of the smart devices that you can now put in terms of your water consumption and others. So this, again, is a very intriguing set of markers that we use to kind of track trends as they're starting to evolve. And with that, I'll turn this over to Hannah.
I was just going to say, we've got a question, if we go back to devices and just around AR and VR, and your thoughts on why they seem so low. Is it a case of there's no killer app at the moment, or is it just more focused in on games?
Well, I think, it's helpful to really look at that if you split that into, VR especially. I think there's been a lot of evolution in the devices themselves. And I think that maturing, as we see new devices in AR, VR come out, has kind of really run ahead of content. And so I think content, is part of what I would call kind of the killer app. VR and AR headsets and glasses are really about performing activities and consuming content. And I think there's been kind of a lag in having, really enticing, intriguing, attractive content outside of some of the gaming areas. And I think that has really held them back over the years. But I think, we're starting to see opportunities for that to change. With the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen consumers really seeking out new experiences, with their content. And we've started to see some providers really refocusing to being able to provide some of those augmented or even virtual experiences. So it is something that we're looking at.
Yeah, and I'd even go as to say that, games certainly, and we're starting to see a lot more the AR side of it as opposed to VR. I mean, USGA recently had it with the Open. So we're starting to see a lot more applications, and obviously around kind of medical devices, but we're also seeing how field agents are using it as well, where they're using the AR capability, and there's someone, I'll call it, back at HQ, who's also advising them based on the information that's coming through and put through. So we are seeing more and more of those kind of applications coming in through the real world.
Absolutely. Excellent question. Excellent. So Hannah, I'll go ahead and turn that over to you to talk about subscriptions.
So now we'll dig into a bit of subscriptions, but as Yvonne and Ian mentioned, we wanted to make this one interactive, right? So before I even reveal any more stats, we're actually going to open up a poll. And if we move to the next slide, you're going to see a poll pop up. And this is all about entertainment subscriptions. So we'd love for you guys just to put in there, how many paid entertainment subscriptions do you currently subscribe to? And it'll be interesting to take this poll amongst us here and see how we stack up against the general US populace. So hopefully you should all see the pop-up window for polls come up for you. And, as Kevin and I always go through this year on year as we see this, so it'll be interesting to see how the numbers kick in with you all. Okay, starting to see a few votes come in now. Right now, between 1 and 4 seems to be the general consensus. Got a few folks coming in between 5 and 8. We'll hold it open for a few more seconds if there's anyone else who wants to cast their vote in. For those who are taking longer, I presume you've got a lot of subscriptions that you're tallying up in your head right now.
We just got one with none.
Ah, interesting. And I know this took me a bit of time as I was tallying mine up, and more than anything, it dawned upon me that I'm probably spending way too much money per month on my entertainment subscription. So it definitely gave me that reality check as well. But we'll talk more about that as we go through. I think we've got a majority of folks in, so we can probably end the poll. And actually, if we see the results as the way they came through, majority of you folks all came in at 1 to 4, as Ian mentioned, 1 with none, and some in with 5 to 8. Well, let's actually go to the next slide. What you'll be surprised to see, based on where we're at, it's actually 12 on average in terms of paid entertainment subscriptions. And here you can see the millennials are certainly above that average with 17 paid subscriptions. Now, when you tally that up, that is a fair amount that people are dipping into for their various, I'll call it, overall entertainment portfolio. And here you can even see that, I'm sure as we started calculating this, we probably thought about our kind of obvious video streaming subscriptions that we have. And here you can see that, on average, folks have 3 video subscriptions. But then you ask, what are the other ones that they've really got? So if we move to the next slide, what you can see is when we actually look across the board, pay TV is still strong. Think of that as your cable broadcast subscription. Streaming videos, what we mentioned, there's 3. Think of that as maybe your Netflix, your Amazon Prime, your Disney Pluses, this world. And then you've got streaming music, which is also very popular, as is gaming. And particularly when you look at the younger generations and Gen Z and millennials, you can see that actually the video, music and gaming presides higher than even traditional pay TV. So you can certainly see what's of greater interest for that younger generation. And we always look to that. And I'll talk more about this. And I always bear in mind whenever we're looking at the stats, I focus in a lot on our Gen Z and millennials, because I really regard them as our behavior barometers. And I'll explain as we go through why that I feel, and Kevin and others here at the firm feel, that that's really important in terms of what's happening around consumption. So if we move to the next slide, what you will see is, certainly the pandemic had an impact. And what we saw, and I'm no doubt read about, is that people did add a lot more subscriptions. We had a lot more time on our hands, certainly in between maybe baking banana bread and constructing the next Lego set with family. We just had more time on our hands, and we certainly use that for entertainment. And here you can see nearly a third of us added at least 1 new video streaming service to our overall portfolio, along with ads on music and gaming, as we saw those early ones, but also audiobooks. And we certainly saw that tick in newspapers and magazines as well. At the same time, there were cancellations, and I will talk about those in more detail as we progress through. But if we move to the next slide, what you can see with that add of those video gaming subscriptions, you can see that certainly on the left-hand side, there was that increase across the board, and the greatest jump actually being with the boomers, but certainly a 7% difference between 73% and 80% as an overall. And even the average, you can see, went up to 4 as opposed to 3, which was the pre-COVID number where I showed you earlier. And you can certainly see that growth across the generations. If we move to the next slide, you can see why. And I touched upon that we just all had more time on our hands since the onset of the pandemic. But what we can see on the left-hand side is, more than half of us said that, but some of us thought about it from we wanted different types of content. The fact that there's just more of us at home, so we had a greater requirement for that content. But really going on the right-hand side is where I want you to anchor in. And what we've seen a lot of folks come back with is the main reason being original content that you just can't get anywhere else. Now, I'll pick out an example just for myself that, and few of you may be aware of this phenomena where it used to be kind of called the Game of Thrones phenomena, where every season people would subscribe for that particular show, And then once it ended, they will cancel their subscription. I've been guilty of that. Thankfully, this time around, they had some other shows like Chernobyl and etc. that, again, original content that kept me there. But we also saw, a third of us actually look around and from a free trial or discounted rate, which a lot of those providers were doing. Now, bear in mind, there's over 300 different offers within the US for different streaming platforms just available to us. So we're not short for choice. And certainly some of those are giving those free trials and discounted rates. And, we even saw how some of the new entrants, even in this summer, did that as well. If we actually go to the next slide, what I want to anchor in on here,
One quick question we had, Hanish, that came in was really understanding if that trend that we're seeing, if we think that might change dramatically after the pandemic is completed, or once things hopefully get back to normal.
Yeah, I kind of look at it from a perspective that one of the things that I see, and certainly with folks that I talk to in the industry, is that everyone tends to do this kind of annual audit. And what do I mean by that? And it's, well, we all kind of tallied up how many subscriptions that we've got, right? And, you kind of look at that, and I know certainly I do that come the start of every new kind of calendar year and think, how many have I tallied up? Because you don't realize sometimes how many you add up throughout the course of the year. And then you do a bit of a correction. And I kind of feel that that's what most folks will do. I think, we probably took on a lot of different offers and content and variety of things, and then you kind of bed into what you really like. So to answer that question, I don't know if it would drastically change, because I think it's just something that by practice we tend to do. And as there are more different things that are coming into place, we may take those on, other things fall away. And it all depends on what shows or what services or platforms we really value. Okay.
Perfect.
Just a quick one here around, and the big call outs again, I'm anchoring on those younger generations, is around just the amount of viewing that's actually taking place. You can see on social networks. So we talked a little bit around those streaming video options and traditional paid TV. There's obviously the ad supported side, and I know Kevin's going to talk more in detail about that as we progress through. But it's those social networks that is quite interesting, particularly for those younger generations, where if you're really trying to target those folks, they tend to, as we know, anyone who's got kids of that age, spend a lot of time on those networks. And it's not just social chat, but they're actually viewing more and more content. They're listening to more and more music. So it certainly is a channel that the younger generations are actually using as a part of their entertainment portfolio. And what I want to move to is the next section is, I talked about, all of these choices we got, and certainly similar to the question, do we kind of see that drastically change when the pandemic's over? Well, people are already doing the math. They're already adding that up. And if we look at the next slide, what we're hearing, and certainly I put myself in this bracket, is sometimes I'm just overwhelmed with the amount of subscriptions I got. And a quarter of us are actually saying that, and as high as 40% for our millennials. And again, remembering they've got 17 subscriptions on average. So it's a lot to manage, right? And they certainly, again, 28% are saying they actually intend to reduce the number of subscriptions. And millennials, again, being very high. So it goes back to that, maybe not even annual audit, they may be doing one a bit more frequent. And I'll talk a bit more about current economic conditions, but given where we all stand in the US and the impact it's had on household income, we're only going to see that potentially magnify. But let's dig in on the next slide as to why some folks are feeling overwhelmed. And the biggest thing is that, we're seeing a lot of what's called takedowns. You're watching a show, you may not even got to the end of the season, but at the calendar month, that show's no longer available and new ones are, because, the library always tends to get refreshed, even if it's one of the platforms that have a very large library. The other part is, you see the second one, it's harder to find content. And that's probably why I myself have, north of those 12 average subscriptions, because I can't get what I want as my entertainment mix from just one or two platforms. I have to go to a variety to really kind of pick what I need. The other part is interesting, and we're finding that, and that's a key thing for anyone who's a content provider, is how can you make it easier for us as consumers to really discover content and find that content? And that's becoming more and more prevalent as we've got multiple different platforms. Now, there are things like Home Assistants that are plugged in that you can ask them the question and they can find that, but it's not fully there yet, where you can just, you've got that virtual butler, as I like to call it, where you'll ask him or her that, hey, I'd love to get X content, and they know exactly what platform to go on because I've already got that subscription. So we're definitely seeing that kind of, I guess, frustration is what I'll call it. And you'll see that if we move to the next slide, where this is a pre-COVID view. A fifth of us said we've cut their service just in the last 12 months. And again, those millennials peaking at 27%. So certainly a much higher percentage on those folks. Again, remembering they had 17 subscriptions on their side. But why is it that they actually cut their subscription? Well, a lot of them said they finished seeing the show or the series. I gave my example earlier for something I did, right? Where it's done and now I'll move on. Others are saying it's quite expensive. And then we talked about that frustration where it just disappeared from the platform. So let's actually take a look at what that looked like from the perspective of going to the next slide. I actually mentioned that, the economic conditions. Now, 2/5 of us have said our income has decreased since the onset of the pandemic. Again, we were quite surprised when we saw that number when you look at some of the stats that are being put in the public domain. But again, they're bearing in mind some of the folks are kids still at home and the way they're kind of measuring those numbers. But let's see that actually manifest itself in some of that data. Well, but before I do, another question for you folks, because I want to see if you can guess where this kind of stands out. So polling question time. And the question on this one, what we're really looking at is, what percentage of subscribers do you think has actually cancelled a paid subscription service since the onset of the pandemic? Now, I think actually I'm seeing the first question come back up. Oh, there we go. If you scroll down, there we are. So if anyone would like to hazard a guess as to what that number looks like. Hopefully you can all see the polling question come up. No responses. Okay, we've got a couple of responses coming in. So we've got 4%. We've got some coming in at 8%. We'll give it a few more seconds to see if anyone else wants to put in a vote. Okay, a few more have come in. Someone's coming as high as 25%. We've got the extremes at 4% and 25%. Give it a second or so. Oh, it looks like a few folks having some challenges on, it looks like the way the poll has been set, where everyone's having to put in. I apologize for the way it's coming through. We'll try and bear through. So I think it's forcing everyone to actually put in the questions for every single question, unfortunately. Okay, not a problem. We'll work around it. So apologies if you're having to re-answer the questions. Let's crack on and give you guys the answer. So we had a mixture of those coming in at 4, 8, 11. No one actually chose 17%. So 17% is actually the answer on this one, where again, nearly a fifth of us have cancelled since the onset of the pandemic. And again, it's looking like as high as the millennials at 25%. And at this point, you've probably got to ask, okay, well, Hanish keeps on banging on about the millennials, the younger generations. Why do I do that? Again, I mentioned that sort of behavior barometers. And the way that I best describe this is something that we at Deloitte have certainly seen, that because you're in one generational category, as you age, it doesn't mean all of a sudden you're going to take on the behaviors of the older generation. What we're actually seeing is you're actually carrying those behaviors through. So what you do today, you will do tomorrow, even if you've moved on into the next kind of age cohort. And that's why I really call upon that younger generation to give us that view as to what it looks like going forward. And I'll use a very quick example for this. Certainly I'm aging myself in this example, but growing up, when it became to new technology or entertainment or ways of consuming, it was the head of the household. So for me, when the VCR entered the home, and for those of you who are too young to even know what I mean, I'm talking about the old school video cassette here. That was, wow, you could record something, you could pause it, you could rewind it, watch it again. For me as a child, that blew my mind. Now I fast forward to today and I've got my children introducing me to new entertainment mediums where, they're watching videos in a vertical format on their phone. We're streaming that onto my TV device, and it's on a TikTok channel by an artist that I've never heard before, by a random influencer I've never heard before, but it has the whole family trying to perfect the latest dance move, and that seems to be our Saturday night entertainment now. So things have certainly moved on from learning about VCRs to now having my children introduced to new ways of consuming. So it's certainly moved on from that perspective. So with that, let's move to the next slide before I embarrass myself further on what I do on a Saturday night. But what you're seeing here is now, since the onset of the pandemic, it's expense. It's all about either it's too expensive or my free trial ended. So we're certainly seeing the impact of that 39% you saw earlier with the reduction in household income. So it also goes back to the question earlier about, is this a trend during pandemic? Are we going to see some drastic changes? I think a lot of it will determine about just the duration we all feel that we're in this current predicament as to the impact in terms of what we prioritize as our entertainment, what we regard as our entertainment, and where we want to put our hard-earned dollars. And with that, let's move to the next section. So Kevin, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Hanish. And, building on a couple of the points that Hanish mentioned in terms of just kind of the increase that we've seen in consumers, accessing their content from ad-supported platforms, and just how in that previous slide we saw that it was, starting to become perhaps a factor. Just want to talk a little bit about the growth in advertising and advertising supported video, and tie that to some of the advertising sentiment and the evolution of the industry in general. One of the big things is that nearly 40% of consumers are saying that they have watched more ad-supported video than last year. And if you look at the generational breakdown, then that's even more. The younger generations, feel empowered to access, these ad-supported, services, whether they're free or paid, to get their content. They're looking into a broader set of services. And part of the reason they're doing that, it's not just because of cost, although of course cost is a factor in that, but it's also because we've seen an evolution in the content as well. In November, December of last year, beginning of this year, we saw a number of new services that were launched that were ad supported, and they were bringing this new, attractive, intriguing content, really kind of capitalizing on that appetite that consumers have for this new original content that is interesting to them. And so we're starting to see more ad-supported platforms, kind of adapting to that consumer trend to provide that content that is more intriguing to them and giving them more options to access it. And in fact, now almost half of consumers, 47% of them, say they are currently using free ad-supported streaming services. And you can see from before COVID, that this is a fairly significant jump overall. We've seen, especially among the youngest generations, you can see that's a double-digit jump from 46 to 58%. But significant growth overall, as during the pandemic, not only have people really kind of tried to embrace some of their cost-conscious, tendencies, but with the reduction of, kind of newly produced content, whether that was a TV series they were watching or something like that, as kind of that content production kind of ground to a halt for a period of time, I think consumers have really kind of reached out and explored some new content libraries on these platforms. And what's been very interesting is when we asked consumers about, if you're going to add another service, which would be your preference? Would you pay for it, to avoid ads, or would you really wants some kind of ad-supported option, we got some really kind of counterintuitive results. I think for a long time, industry has thought that, most consumers are really very ad allergic. They want to avoid ads at all costs, and they're willing to pay to do that. What we found, if you look on the right, is really just over a third of consumers are really I do not want to experience ads and I'm willing to pay for it. Leaving, over 60% of consumers, willing to exchange their attention, to ads for a reduction in cost, whether that's down to a $6 a month subscription fee or even to go to free. And among that ad supported tier option, there's over 40%, nearly 45%, since COVID, that are really saying, I want to avoid paying entirely. And this was a little, unexpected when we were kind of analyzing this data, just the level of which people are really saying, when I add a new service, I really want an ad-supported tier option for that. And this is, I think, what we've seen a lot of these new entrants really starting to capitalize on that consumer sentiment. And for our next polling question, we can go ahead and launch this. I'll go ahead and just, maybe we can, use this in a very way. So polling question number 3 is, how many minutes of advertising on average per hour do you think that consumers encounter regularly on pay TV? This is your broadcast, your cable, or satellite. And we recognize that this is going to vary based on the channels that you watch, but just kind of an on average target, what you think that might be. And I think the options we had were 15 minutes, 17 minutes, 20 minutes. Looks like we're getting a couple of responses already. A couple with the 20 minutes. Looks like a few at 15 to 17. But going all the way up to 23 and 25 minutes, and really trying to understand, what is the ad load that consumers are currently enduring when they are on these broadcast channels. And I know at least for me, the challenge with some of these broadcasts is that's my opportunity to get up and go to the kitchen. So this endurance is not garnered with attention. It's more of an opportunity for a break in the content. And that's been a challenge for advertisers as well, is getting that consumer engagement. It looks like we've got just a few responses there, and 15, 17 minutes, looks like the majority coming in there. And again, I apologize for the technical difficulties in having to re-enter everything more than once. But I think we can probably just go ahead and move forward here, and I'll just share the results of that. I think most people were 15 to 17 minutes of this. What on average we found as looking is that the average ad load for broadcast cable TV is about 20 minutes per hour. And that, when you put that in comparison to what consumers say their ad tolerance range is, we start to see that disconnect illustrated quite well. Consumers tell us that about 7 minutes of ads per hour is what they say is just right. And if you get to about 14 minutes of ads per hour, that's when they say they'll stop watching the content. And so, historically, at 20 minutes, we can see that there has been a significant disconnect between the platforms and the content they're providing, supported by ads, and what consumers' expectations and desires really are. And so the big evolution I think we've seen this year is that we've seen a number of new entrants into the market that have really tried to focus in on not only achieving consumer expectations, but in some cases surpassing them. If we look at Peacock, for instance, that was launched earlier this year, they're running at about 5 minutes of ads per hour and trying to keep their ad load quite low. And as well, they're focusing in on duration and repetition, a couple of factors that we'll talk through next. Because about 82% of consumers, and this is fairly consistent across the generations, well over 70% across every generation, up to 95 of matures, say there's way too much repetition in ads. People don't like or feel the need to see the same ad multiple times. And in terms of kind of that ad duration, what's been very interesting is that 66% of consumers say, I will pay more attention to an ad under 10 seconds. And again, something that especially among the younger generations we find to be true is that they want these ads to be very short. And the upside to that, if you look at the bottom there, is that over half of them saying they're going to pay more attention to those ads if they can skip them or if they're short. Those first few seconds are the most impactful for advertisers to be able to get their message across and capture the attention of these consumers, which is the ultimate goal. And then once you kind of have them on your platform and you've got captured their attention, the next thing we try to look at here is, what's the level of influence that you're having on buying decisions across the consumers. And overall, what we find is that the younger consumers are just far more influenced on their digital channels than any of the other consumers. We see that looking down the Gen Z and millennial columns, that they're just far more influenced because they spend far more time on those. But very interesting that while online reviews are top the charts across the board, and I don't think there's any surprise there for all of us, we all check the number of stars or the number of likes on a product, to try and get a sense of, is this product or is this service something that others have liked and therefore rely. But for the Gen Z and millennials, these ads that are on social platforms, such as Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, you name it, these have the second level of influence. They're second highest in their ability to influence the buying decisions of these millennials. And that's really where these different products and services really are starting to capitalize and meet consumers where they are. And now I will turn this over to Hanish, to walk us quickly through the gaming.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kevin. So let's go to the next slide and really talk about gaming. Now, bearing in mind, Generation X was the generation that grew up gaming, right? But still a quarter of us, and I'm a Gen Xer, I'm still a gamer. So I'm one of that 25%. So we're still out there gaming. And as you'd expect, it's really the Gen Zs and the millennials are really kind of pushing that bracket up. But again, it's a top 3 favorite activity, along with watching TV and movies and listening to music. It's right up there for a good number of the generations. But let's have a look at what impact COVID has actually had on gaming. And what you are starting to see is not just the pastime that I mentioned at the top 3 pastime, but we're actually seeing that folks really turn to gaming during the onset of the pandemic to help them get through a difficult time. Now, I certainly am not going to show these stats to my kids because they'll only justify them playing even more than they actually do. But, in all fairness, we're actually starting to see that younger generations are using gaming for helping for a difficult time or passing time. And actually some folks as high as Gen Z, 49%, that it actually helped them stay connected with other folks. So that's kind of what we're seeing. If we move to the next slide there, what I want to kind of tap in on is nearly half of us did some form of gaming activity since the onset of the pandemic. And that's a huge amount. Now, again, anchoring in on those younger generation, they're certainly doing more. Matures, negligible as to whether they did at all with that 1%. But you can clearly see that, big population, a big swath of people in the US actually turned to gaming. And if we move to the right-hand side, you can see that it's 34% of us just did it as a family activity. And 27, again, to connect with others socially. Now, as the onset of pandemic, we all saw that sports literally stopped close to overnight. So a lot of people used gaming and watching celebrities and athletes play virtualized sports. Like I actually watched a virtualized Formula One race, for example, just to see what that would be, because Formula One fell away. And there are a lot of stars or pro athletes playing the sport that they normally would do as a way of competitive measure. But it's that bottom one, even though it's the smallest percentage, that people started actually broadcasting their own content. So let's think about that a little bit more, right? So you're actually playing and you're actually broadcasting your own content. So if we move to the next slide, what you'll actually see here is that 25%, so a quarter of us, actually watch someone else's gameplay. And I'll let that sink in for a sec. It's not that we're actually playing, we're spending our time, or a quarter of us are watching someone else play a video game and actually tuning in to actually do that. And more than 50% of Gen Zs are doing that, and millennials are doing that in high order as well. But 21% of us actually live streamed our own gameplay. And again, that's quite a high number, particularly when you think about 39% of Gen Z and 37% of millennials. So I would like to round out with a quick polling question for you all. And this is the last one, I do promise. And this is really to kind of see where you guys think is, during this pandemic, during the onset, what percentage do you think of consumers watch others playing a video game?
And this is Ian, I did refresh just because we only had a couple people respond last time. Just if you don't mind scrolling to the fourth question, just so we can get more than the 4 or 5 from the last time. Sorry again for the technical issues. So again, this will be question number 4 in the polling questions.
Okay, yeah, we're coming in. So we've got someone coming in with 7%, few folks at 7%, others coming in at 21%. So quite a high number there, and quite a lower number at 7%. Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to put you all out of your misery and let you know that the actual number was 30%. That's right, nearly a third of us actually watched someone else playing a video game of some order or another. Now, a number of those who are gamers probably watched the walkthroughs. How do I get to the next level? How do I get better? And I mentioned earlier that people are actually watching professional gamers live streaming their gameplay, pro athletes. But it's really that last one that I want to dig into, which is the esports and the growth of that phenomenon. What we've seen over the last few years is a significant amount of dollars, and large brands have put their names behind esports leagues or esports teams. And you're starting to see big brands actually put sponsorship towards certain leagues as well. And we're certainly watching it as a firm as well, in terms of the growth of that practice and seeing what's taking place in that industry. And to really kind of bring it home, I'll give you a stat, or I'll give you a data point that's not even in the survey, but we just have to scroll back to literally last year. And I'm sure a number of you heard about that 16-year-old who won that Fortnite tournament, and he walked away with $3 million. And in that month, and that's right, $3 million for winning a video game championship. In that same month, the gentlemen and ladies winners of Wimbledon walked away with less money. So I think on that note, to round this section off, I'll leave you with a dilemma. As we're moving up to holiday season, are you going to be buying your loved one a tennis racket or a gaming console? But in the next few minutes, let's move on to the next bit. And I kind of want to round out, and it's a little bit of a whirlwind, and some of the things that Ian, Kevin, I, and others in the practice are really looking at is just the big emerging trends. As we've talked to you about some of the consumer behaviors with devices, subscriptions, feeling overwhelmed, how we're looking at advertising, maybe ad-supported solutions, the impact of gaming. But let's flip to the next side. And I just want to, 15, 20 seconds on each of these kind of big areas. And we're starting to see, obviously, more and more take place from a cloud gaming perspective. So, it's certainly more so that traditionally where we'd have the console, you're certainly now moving into more and more gaming taking place in the cloud. Not saying it's eradicating the console, but you're seeing more and more services coming in where it's just cloud-based gaming. We had some questions earlier on AR and VR. Again, I actually believe this is going to continue to grow. And I certainly believe that AR is going to be implemented in a much more wider way earlier on. But as we look for more and more immersive experiences, particularly even from an entertainment perspective or from a professional environment or day-to-day perspective, VR will start coming more and more into play. Now, with all of this, it'll be remiss of us if we didn't talk about data privacy and security. It's been a hot topic for a many number of years, and we're seeing more and more of it come into play. And actually, we as consumers are becoming significantly more savvy about how our data is being used. And I definitely think there was extremes where we didn't know much about it, and then we swung all this way across that kind of said, hey, I can't have you having my data, can't be sharing my data. And then we're kind of petering back in maybe here with some folks, and some of us saying, well, actually, it's somewhat valuable because I'm getting personalized experiences, more about what I like, what I don't like. If you didn't have that data on me, I would just get a vanilla experience, which wouldn't make it as delightful as what it is right now. 5G, the onset of that, and we're starting to see more and more of that come into play, has the impact it's going to have on just so many kind of chatty devices, as you see, lower latency, but obviously starting to see more of those kind of private 5G networks come into play. AI, huge, and we've seen that come more and more into play as so many companies across various fields are using machine learning, are using artificial intelligence to make more insightful, intelligent, informed decisions over time. And even Yvonne up front talked about edge, and we see that edge computing more and more is about how do you bring that greater intelligence to the edge with, again, so many different devices, so much computation needing to take place, and the closer you can have it to you. So we're starting to see some of these things merging, and others are a little bit nascent, others are a bit more formed. But wanted to kind of round off in a little bit of a whirlwind way of just some of the areas that we're seeing as emerging trends as well. So I will pause there. I know we have a few minutes, would love to field any questions that you may have for Kevin, Ian, or I. Or any comments, any thoughts that you're seeing in the industry in your respective areas as well. If not, I can certainly hand back to Ian and Yvonne.
And if you'd like to ask any questions, obviously unmute yourself, but happy to answer anything for the next few minutes.
Yeah, I have a question. So since the pandemic, a lot of different online communities or things like that have been moving over to Facebook and setting up Facebook private communities, which has its own issues involved, because not everyone in your community would be on Facebook, and some people are blatantly against being on Facebook and don't want to be on Facebook. So especially in the case of gaming, there's also gaming communities. In those cases, they handle it themselves. But what is your thoughts on that from a business perspective?
Kevin, do either of you want to take that one, or?
I'll let you start, Hanish, if you want.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can certainly say from a gaming perspective, it's an interesting space in the sense that there are a number of gaming communities out there, and it depends a lot on, I would say, the title as well, right? That you're playing, that certain titles lend themselves to a greater community aspect. You're starting to see more and more gamers, for example, go on to platforms like Discord as well, to name just one as an example, where they're using that. Maybe if the game itself doesn't have I'll call it the community chat capability, that they're supplementing that with another service to do that. So it's certainly showing that gamers want to have that community aspect beyond just that, maybe the one-to-one or the 1-to-4 gaming that may be taking place, but a wider community aspect of that. So you're certainly seeing platforms tap into that aspect. Now, what it does mean is that then to get the full experience, either you've got to be on that said platform, or in that example, I've said you've got to choose other platforms and complement your overall experience. I think in terms of how things will progress will determine just in terms of just how that experience is. I lead back to a lot of these things, be that you're talking gaming, video, music, or just software or whatever it be. It all boils down to a lot of the experience the end user gets. And if you can make that experience significantly more delightful, if you can make it easier to be accessible, to get their entire mix of what they're looking for, then you're onto a winning formula. And that's kind of what I look at as one example. Does that answer your question in terms of where you're going, or were you looking for something very different in that?
Yeah, especially the very end part. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I think we also got one more question on the text chat around kind of personalized services and our thoughts on services like Noom. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that service.
I'm not personally, I'll be honest. If someone wants to,
I know,
yeah. Sorry, go on, Ivan.
as far as I know, Noom is a personal service for food and diet, kind of related. So you get a personal nutritionist who looks over everything related to you, and then works on something that fits your style and your everything.
Got it. Okay, thank you for that. So I can't comment on Noom itself because I don't know enough about it. But if I take just overall personalized services, again, it boils down to the experience that you could get. If I, as a consumer, want to get a particular personalized service, in this case, I think we're talking nutrition and health, right? Or whether it be entertainment, if it's achieving what I want to achieve, and I know the value exchange I'm giving for that, either through hard dollars or my own personalized data, as long as I'm aware of that value exchange that I'm giving, I'm likely to engage and want to have that personalized service if it's achieving what I want to achieve. And I also think that with all the things that are available to us, and I used that example earlier up front, around 300 streaming services available to us. So there's a plethora of choices. So again, that differentiation by any particular service, be that by cost, or be that by brand, or be that by personalization towards what it's offering the end consumer, is probably the number of the choices that I'm going to look at when I'm making a selection towards a given service. So I guess where I'm going to with the answer of that, and again, because I don't know Noom itself, so I can't talk to that, is if that personalized service is giving me what I want, and I understand the value exchange that I'm giving back for it, and I feel that that's a value, then I think that's going to be a successful service for me as a person to engage in that service.
Awesome. Well, I know we're a little bit over time. I do appreciate everybody kind of taking the time this morning to participate in the dialogue. Obviously, the text chat feature did help in the discussion and the questions at the end. We will make the slides available, which is general practice through ACG. And on there, obviously, you'll have contact information to the extent you have any follow-up questions or anything else we can help with. But thanks to both Kevin and Hanish for taking the time today for the conversation, and Yvonne and Carol for the logistical support and obviously coordination in putting on an event like this. So thank you. And thanks for everybody's attendance. Yvonne, any parting words?
Just wanted to thank Deloitte again for putting on this event. Super interesting data, and I don't feel so bad about my kids watching other kids play video games now that I know 30% of the population is doing that. I will just never understand, but yeah, thank you for the tremendously interesting data that you shared with us. And thanks to everyone who joined us today, and fantastic expertise. And thank you. Join us again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.